Hello, my name is Jeanette Sheliga, and this mini presentation is called United States Delayed Birth Certificates. One of the staples of sought-after genealogy records are finding birth, marriage, and death certificates for our ancestors. However, there is no common start date across the United States as to when each state and/or the municipalities within that state started keeping records of vital events. So you may have to do a bit of locality research to find out when your area of interest started keeping those vital records. Focusing on statewide requirement of recording births, you can see that very few states had a law in place between the 1840s and 1890s. Even when the states did start to require births to be recorded, it sometimes took years and even decades for full compliance to happen. In New York State, for example, they tried a few times to require vital records to be recorded and failed. In 1880, they passed another law which did seem to stick, but it is believed that full compliance wasn't met until about 1913, 1914. At the beginning of the 20th century, many more states passed laws requiring births to be recorded, as shown on this map here in pink. And then within the next decade of the 1910s, most of the country had passed laws, leaving just New Mexico that passed their law in the 1920s and Vermont in the 1950s. So now that we've clarified that new births were being recorded across the United States, let's shift our focus to the millions of Americans that had been born prior to when birth registration requirements were put into place. There were two major events that largely contributed to all of those millions of Americans that were born without a birth certificate and causing them to want to apply for a delayed birth certificate. And that was the Social Security Act in the 1930s and World War II in the 1940s. Shortly after Social Security was enacted, you can find newspaper articles such as this one that help to explain to the citizens about the procedures for collecting Social Security benefits, in which it states to qualify for a monthly benefit, a wage earner must be 65 years old. So they had to be of a certain age. And the article later states that proof of birth was needed for claims in excess of $100. So I guess the government didn't want to pay out benefits to those claiming to be 65 years old when they really weren't. In 1941, another news article titled 60 Million Americans Can't Prove Their Birth talked about how most Americans hadn't worried about, not having a birth certificate until a few years prior to that, as before, Social Security and that, it was only really needed for obtaining a passport. But with the start of World War II, Congress decreed that only American citizens could be employed in factories working on government contracts. So without birth certificates, many people had to find proof that they were citizens. In 1942, Good Housekeeping had an article titled Why You Need a Birth Certificate, which included a section stating you may need a birth certificate if you are subject to the draft, enlist in the Navy or Air Corps, hold a civil service job, work in a coastal area, live in a coastal area, hold a civilian defense post, run for political office, claim Social Security, annuities, pensions, wish to vote, enroll in a school or university, work at a dam, power plant, watershed, etc., work as a teacher, policeman, or fireman, are of Japanese ancestry, and want to get a passport. With all of those reasons, many of those 60 million Americans without a birth certificate were then trying to obtain one. But many states did not have laws and procedures in place for issuing a delayed certificate. With World War II underway, the War, Navy, and Commerce departments together urged the states to adopt a uniform plan for issuing those delayed certificates of birth and to allow for evidence such as family Bibles, hospital records, and insurance policies to help approve those delayed birth certificates. You can find state statutes such as this one from Indiana in 1941, where they were giving the courts the authority to determine time and place of death. So let's take a look at some of these delayed birth certificates. Like most records, delayed birth certificates contents and evidence requirements varied by state and evolved over time. That being said, you can expect a certain basic amount of information to appear on each one. The purpose of the record was to establish the particulars of a person's birth with multiple forms of evidence. So the first kind of common part is that it's going to have the applicant's information. That often included the name of the applicant, which in this case was Winifred Preston. Now that was her full name as a child, not her married name. The date and place of birth, she states here that she was born on 16th of February, 1898 at Elmira Heights in Chemung County, New York, and that her sex was a girl. And oftentimes there's an area that includes race, but this particular form did not. The second part that's common is information about the parents, which often will include the names of the parents, including the maiden name of the mother and their places of birth. This particular form also included the year of birth for the parents. Then the applicant needed to provide proof of their birth. And this can be a variety of different documentation. I've seen family Bibles, affidavits from family members, insurance policies, their child's birth certificate that they provided the information, saying how old they were, a physician or midwife's signature, employment records, and census records. In this particular case, Winifred completed an affidavit saying that she was currently a resident of Buffalo and that the states she shared were true to the best of her knowledge. She included 3 items of supporting evidence to her birth. One was the 1915 New York State Census. The second was her marriage record to her husband, which provided her date of birth, but she provided that, her age for that record, but it did list her parents on it. And she also had an affidavit from her older sister. And then the fourth common, information found on this is a date of recording. And these are nice to kind of hypothesize perhaps why your ancestor was filing that delayed birth certificate at that time. If it was in the early 40s, perhaps they were wanting to enlist or work, in a war factory. If it's, closer to perhaps when they're of the age for claiming Social Security, it could be, that instance. In this case, Winifred was 62 years at the time that she applied for her delayed birth certificate, and coming up to the age of collecting Social Security at 65 and the death of her husband, being widowed. Maybe that was what she was hoping to do and why she applied for this. Let's take a look at a second example of a delayed birth record. This one is from Tennessee. You can see across the top, it has common information from the one that we saw in New York State. It includes the applicant's information, their name at birth, their date of birth, where they were born, their race, their sex, the name of their parents and where their parents were born, a signature of the applicant and their present address. And then lower on the form, it includes that proof of birth that, the evidence, the supporting evidence that they were providing to the person that was recording the document. And then this one is kind of neat because the way that they have it listed is they have the information that was provided, but then they pulled out Actually, let me rephrase that. They included the sources that the applicant provided, and then they pulled out the information from each source to kind of correlate the data between them. In this case, she provided a copy of her family birth record on the first line, and then if you look underneath, it shows her date of birth, but not her place of birth, but it did list her parents' names. And then she provided under number 2 was her voting registration certified copy, which included her date of birth and where she was born, but did not include her parents' names. And so she provided 4 pieces of information total that the clerk used to correlate together to approve this. And then it was recorded, which you can see at the bottom. A few things to consider when analyzing a delayed birth certificate. It in itself is an original record as it was newly created at the time of the application. However, the information provided to prove the date, place of birth, and the name of the parents could be from any different kind of sources. It could be primary, secondary, or undetermined. For an example, a primary informant could be an affidavit from the applicant's mother, saying, I was there at the time when my child was born and this was the date. A secondary informant could be the applicant themselves providing, information that they gave to somebody else, such as, when they got their insurance policy, they said, I am this years old, and then they turned that insurance policy in, as evidence, but they were the original informant. And even though the applicant was at their birth, being just born and a baby, they weren't exactly aware of what date, time, and place they were when the event happened. So they actually are getting that information secondarily from somebody like the parents, that was shared, today's your birthday, you were born, 4 years ago today, and they memorized it that way. And lastly, an example of an undetermined source could be census records, because, except for, the 1940 census, we often do not know who the informant was that was providing, where that person was born and when. It could have been the neighbor if the family was not there to provide that information. To find examples or, to find your ancestors in delayed birth certificates, you can check the major genealogy websites. I know that Ancestry and Family Search has collections with them on there, so check your places, maybe they're at MyHeritage or Find My Past as well. I didn't check into that, but, look around the collections and card catalogs and see if you can find them there. And also check with the clerk's offices. The delayed birth certificate did not need to be filed in the same place where the birth occurred. So knowing that perhaps a person was born in Illinois, but then starting in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, they were living in Kansas, you would assume then that they would file for their delayed birth certificate in Kansas, because that's where they lived at the time. And when you're requesting a clerk to check to see if a birth certificate existed, be sure to specify that you're requesting them to look for a delayed birth certificate, because oftentimes those were not kept in the regular birth certificate area. Those were filed separately and would maybe have their own index. So, clarify that you're looking for a delayed birth certificate. And then lastly, genealogy libraries and other repositories might have books such as pictured here, where authors and volunteers have combed through different county delayed birth certificate registers and created an index of all the ones that they found. I found books like these at both the Genealogy Center at the Allen County Public Library in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and at the DAR Library in Washington, D.C. So check around with your local repositories and see if they might have some of these books. Guides like this can definitely help you locate if the delayed birth record exists, and then you can track down, where that was recorded and get a copy for yourself. And lastly, if you're interested in learning more on this topic, I highly suggest going to Legacy Family Tree webinars if you have a subscription, and if not, they're wonderful. Sunny Morton has done an amazing presentation on this called Born to be Filed, Delayed Birth Records in the United States. Sunny and I researched this topic together, and she's an amazing educator and friend. So you'll learn a lot from her from that presentation. I hope that this mini presentation helps you to possibly find delayed birth certificates for your ancestors, and that you're excited to check out this source for birth records. Thank you so much.